The Dark Scrolls. Under the flickering light of a tallow candle, one finds in the dusty vaults of England's Tudor age a peculiar obsession, one that gleamed as white as alabaster and stank faintly of vinegar and rot. It was the age when beauty was not a gift, but an instrument, sharpened like a blade to defend power, mask decay, and preserve the illusion of divine perfection. In that gilded court where mirrors were rare and portraits were truth's replacements, women were crafted, not born. Each layer of powder and pigment an act of submission to an impossible ideal. In the reign of the Tudors, beauty itself was governance. The pale face of a queen could quiet a rebellion. The faint flush of her lip could carry an empire's image across Europe. Yet beneath the paint and ceremony lay something both fragile and monstrous, the understanding that beauty, in this court, was no longer human. It was ritual. It was duty. It was survival. The Tudor court glittered with ambition, intrigue, and the cold discipline of image. It was a world where the body of a monarch was never entirely her own. When Henry VIII cast aside one queen after another in his quest for heirs, it became clear that a woman's face was not merely ornament, but emblem. Her skin, a parchment on which the state's anxieties were written. Catherine of Aragon's austere dignity, Anne Boleyn's dark allure, Jane Seymour's serene modesty. Each face told a story England was forced to believe. And after them all came Elizabeth, whose painted mask became not only her armor, but her throne. Beauty, in this era, was inseparable from politics. It functioned as propaganda long before the word existed. Ambassadors wrote reports not of armies or harvests, but of the Queen's complexion, whether her color seemed fresh, her eyes bright, her face without blemish. For to see Elizabeth was to read England itself, prosperous, unaging, untouchable. A single freckle, a single wrinkle could imply weakness, and so the court apothecaries became priests of illusion, their crucibles and mortars as sacred as any altar. They mixed their sacraments from the elements of death itself. Venetian ceruse, made of finely ground white lead and vinegar, was imported at enormous cost, praised as the purest cosmetic in Christendom. When applied, it lent the skin an otherworldly pallor, smooth as porcelain, gleaming under torchlight. But its cost was not measured in coin. The lead seeped through the pores, mingling with the blood, stiffening the flesh, deadening the nerves. Slowly, invisibly, it devoured its devotees from within. To the Tudors, however, pallor meant privilege. A pale face signified that one did not toil in the sun, that one's hands were unblemished by labor. It was proof of breeding. To be fair was not merely to be beautiful. It was to be powerful. The court's physicians and scholars might whisper of humors, of balance and bile, of complexion as destiny. But in truth, the ideal was political. Whiteness meant distance from the world's corruption. The Queen's ghostly hue was not illness, but sanctity. The archives describe the Queen's dressing chamber as a place of both reverence and fear. There, before dawn, attendants prepared the tools of transformation. Boxes of powder, jars of rouge, brushes, and tiny silver spoons for applying the mixture. The air was thick with vinegar and rosewater. The Queen sat unmoving, as though carved from marble, while the ceruse was laid on her face in slow, deliberate strokes. Her ladies-in-waiting whispered prayers under their breath, For each application was a kind of communion, an anointing with poison. They knew what it did. The skin beneath the paint cracked, blistered, and burned. When the sores grew too painful, another layer was added to hide them. When hair fell out, wigs of human and horse hair replaced it. When the teeth blackened, lips were reddened further. The smile transformed into a crimson illusion. The queen's face became less flesh and more symbol, a painted promise that time could not claim her. But there is cruelty in perfection. Venetian ceruse, once praised by poets, was whispered to be cursed by alchemists. Some said it carried the spirit of Saturn, the planet of decay and melancholy. Others, that it bound its wearer to vanity's slow death, a pact sealed not in ink, but in blood. Yet Elizabeth persisted. Her devotion to the image was absolute. To appear without her mask would be to expose the mortal beneath the myth, and England could not bear to see its virgin queen as a frail old woman. The Tudor cult of beauty reached beyond the queen's chamber. Across the court, noble women competed in the same fatal devotion. They bled their faces to achieve pallor, rubbed mercury on their skin to smooth imperfections, washed in wine to purify the flesh. Their lips shone with cinnabar, their cheeks with crushed coral, their eyes with the shimmer of ground pearl. Mirrors, rare and precious, became oracles, reflecting not truth but aspiration. There are letters that speak of women fainting during banquets, their breath shallow, their skin cold to the touch. Yet no one questioned the cause. Illness was simply the tax of splendor. The same poisons that disfigured them also preserved their status. To appear too healthy, too sun-touched, was vulgar, a sign of peasantry. The sickly glow of ceruse was a badge of belonging. Even the men were not immune. Courtiers dusted their faces with lead powder and perfumed their beards with mercury oil. Beauty had become the shared language of deception, a code of class that no one dared break. It was not vanity, but necessity. To appear ordinary was to vanish from the game entirely. In this world, where flesh was mutable and truth negotiable, the line between artifice and identity blurred. A woman's face was no longer her own. It was the property of history, of rumor, of royal need. Elizabeth herself understood this better than anyone. She was both monarch and myths cannot age. Her portraits, meticulously controlled, censored, approved, showed no wrinkles, no fatigue, no human weariness. Painters were ordered to erase the years, to render her as eternal. The mask of lead became the model for the mask of oil and canvas. And yet, in the silence between brushstrokes and ceremonies, one senses the dread that haunted her court, the knowledge that beauty had turned against its bearers. Beneath the music and perfume, behind the jeweled mirrors and silk curtains, lay the faint odor of metal and sickness. Attendants were said to handle her cosmetics with gloves, to dispose of cloths soaked in ceruse as if they were contagious. Some whispered that even her death mask was painted white, as though the lie had to outlive her body. The tragedy of Tudor beauty was not its vanity, but its faith. These women believed in transformation, not as art, but as destiny. The alchemists sought gold. They sought grace. To them, purity of face was proof of purity of soul. If the process hurt, it was simply the body's penance for the spirit's perfection. The more it burned, the closer they came to heaven. And thus the rituals continued. Powder, rouge, perfume, prayer. Each morning a resurrection, each evening a slow death. It was the price of glory, the rhythm of empire. Behind every proclamation and mask, behind the triumphs and portraits that still hang in gilded halls, there lingers the same unspoken truth, that the beauty which dazzled the world was born of corruption, that the immortal face of England's queen was sculpted not by nature or God, but by poison and will. No record tells the full truth. The chemist's notes are lost, the recipes burned or buried with their makers. What remains are fragments, rumors preserved in letters, half-truths in inventories, echoes in portraits. Yet from those fragments emerges the unmistakable shape of a civilization that confused death with divinity. The Tudors, in their hunger for perfection, created beauty that killed slowly and left no visible wound. Some say Elizabeth knew that she understood the danger but saw in it a mirror of monarchy itself, both sustained by illusion, both dependent on faith. The body might fail, but the image must not. To falter in appearance was to invite collapse. And so she endured, the weight of crown and powder alike, until neither could be removed without destroying the other. As the candle burns low and the scroll of memory unrolls, one sees not a woman, but a symbol embalmed in white. The Virgin Queen, untouched by age, untouched by men, untouched by truth. Her beauty, once admired, became her prison. Her face, once her weapon, became her curse. And yet, centuries later, it still shines in portraits, luminous and unblemished, a triumph of poison over time and of illusion over mortality. The age that worshipped her called it elegance. We who look back through the smoke and silence might call it something else. The slow, deliberate art of dying beautifully. The records that survive from that twilight age, letters between ambassadors, fragments of court inventories, even the trembling hand of a lady-in-waiting writing to her kin, paint a picture both splendid and ghastly. They speak of the Queen's mirror, rimmed in gilt, standing at the center of her private chamber, like a relic of some forbidden faith. Before it, the transformation began each dawn. The first act was cleansing, though cleansing in the Tudor sense meant scouring the flesh with vinegar and wine until it burned raw. Attendants would pat her face with soft linen steeped in a tonic of rosewater and spirits, then brush away the night's residue of sweat and lead. Only then could the ceremony of perfection begin. The heart of that ritual was Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic whose very name carried prestige. It came by ship from Italy, sealed in alabaster jars, its powder white as bone dust. To the English court it was said to embody refinement, the art of Venice, that city of glass and mirrors, of masquerades and secrets. Few knew its true nature, a mixture of lead carbonate soaked in vinegar until it bloomed like curdled milk, then dried and ground fine as ash. The women who handled it often coughed blood within months. But in the palace, danger was part of the allure. Everything that promised immortality required a sacrifice. When Elizabeth's face was brushed with ceruse, her skin took on a brilliance that defied age and fatigue. Courtiers compared her to the moon, to ivory, to snow untouched by sun. Her enemies, less kind, whispered that she had turned herself into a ghost before death could claim her. Yet both were correct, for the queen had long understood that the body of a ruler was not private. It was a stage. Its light, or its decay, illuminated the state. In preserving the illusion of youth, she preserved England's power. This was no ordinary vanity. It was political theology. Her father, Henry VIII, had broken from Rome and made himself head of the Church of England, declaring divine right in place of papal blessing. Elizabeth, inheriting a fragile kingdom scarred by her mother's execution and her sister's tyranny, knew she must become an object of worship without the aid of religion. The cult of her image replaced the cult of the Virgin Mary. To maintain that illusion, her face had to transcend the mortal, and thus the poisonous purity of Venetian ceruse became her halo. But time was relentless. Beneath the layers of lead and vinegar, her real skin began to rot. Observers recorded that her hands trembled and her hair thinned. Her gums blackened, her teeth fell out, one by one. Servants whispered that her pillow bore streaks of white each morning, flakes of flesh and powder mingled together. Yet still she ordered more ceruse, more rouge, more perfume. She could not stop. To appear bare was to undo the magic entirely. The contradiction was cruel. Every portrait that showed her ageless inspired awe abroad, yet each new layer of perfection hastened her ruin. In that paradox lay the secret core of Tudor beauty. It demanded devotion, even as it destroyed. To refuse was rebellion. To accept was self-sacrifice. And so the Queen wore her poison like a crown. Her contemporaries followed her example. The ladies of her court became reflections of their sovereign, pale and luminous, each one sculpted into resemblance. They traded recipes in whispers, how to mix the perfect shade, how to soften the sting of vinegar, how to disguise the sores that inevitably came. They experimented with bismuth, mercury, even ground alabaster stolen from church altars. The Queen's image had become a contagion, infecting everyone who sought proximity to her favor. It was during this period that foreign observers began to remark upon the peculiar lifelessness of the English complexion. A French envoy described the women of the court as walking effigies of wax. A Spanish visitor found their beauty unearthly but not of the living. And yet, ambassadors continued to send home portraits and reports, marveling at the Virgin Queen's radiance, never daring to mention the truth they glimpsed up close: the cracks, the trembling, the faint smell of vinegar that clung to her skin like incense. There exists in one surviving letter a curious anecdote. A court painter, anonymous but likely one of those entrusted with royal likenesses, describes being ordered to retouch the Queen's face on canvas after she had viewed the nearly completed work. Her Majesty desired that the shade about her mouth be softened, for it did too nearly resemble the mark of years, he wrote. She commanded that I lay more white upon her countenance, for in her words, England must see no shadow. The painter complied. Thus the myth endured. The alchemists of beauty thrived on that demand. Their recipes blurred the boundaries between medicine, magic, and deceit. They claimed that ceruse purified the blood, that cinnabar could inflame the spirit, that mercury refreshed the complexion. Some even invoked astrology, timing their mixtures to the phases of the moon. Others spoke of secrets brought from the east, powders that could bind the soul within the skin. The language was mystical, but the result was practical. A face without imperfection, a body that appeared untouched by age, pain, or sin. Behind the glamour, however, lay a growing terror. Lead poisoning did not announce itself with violence. It crept. It began with fatigue, then tremors, then paralysis of the limbs. The skin yellowed, the eyes dulled, the voice grew hoarse. Physicians could offer no cure. They bled their patients, purged them with mercury, or prescribed arsenic to balance the humors, unwittingly feeding the same poison in a different form. Thus the circle completed itself. Beauty led to sickness. Sickness required medicine. Medicine deepened the sickness. Among those most afflicted were the women closest to the Queen. Letters mention Lady Mary Sidney's strange fits, thought to be divine visions, but more likely seizures. The Countess of Essex suffered ulcers on her face that no poultice could heal. Some withdrew from court entirely, hiding in country estates under the pretense of piety. Yet no one dared speak openly against the fashion. To criticize the Queen's beauty was to challenge her authority. Silence became the price of survival. Elizabeth herself seemed to grow ever more dependent on her ritual. As the years wore on, she became reclusive, allowing few to see her unpainted. During the final decade of her reign, she is said to have kept mirrors covered, except during her morning toilette. Visitors described her as resplendent by torchlight, but curiously unnatural in daylight, as though the sun exposed something forbidden. One courtier recorded that her face did shine like alabaster, yet her eyes were weary and her countenance most melancholy. There are whispers that she once attempted to abandon the paint, persuaded by her physicians that it worsened her ailments. For a week she appeared at council barefaced, her skin mottled and scarred. The reaction was disastrous. Ambassadors gossiped that the Queen was dying. Courtiers exchanged anxious looks. Rumors of succession spread. Within days, the jars of ceruse returned to her chamber. The experiment ended. The mask resumed. This perhaps was the tragedy of Tudor beauty in its purest form. It enslaved even the ruler who commanded it. The Queen's appearance was the state's stability. Her mortality was a political threat. Each morning she recreated herself not from vanity, but from necessity. The lead, the mercury, the endless layers of paint were not indulgences, but burdens of sovereignty. To wash them away was to risk the kingdom itself. And yet, there was an artistry in it, a mastery of illusion that transcended poison and pain. Elizabeth turned her affliction into theatre. When foreign envoys met her, she dazzled them with her brilliance, her wit, her composure. The glow of the ceruse caught the candlelight and reflected like armor. Her enemies might whisper of decay, but in her presence they saw only radiance. It was as though she had transformed death itself into spectacle. Behind closed doors, however, the cost was immense. The once vibrant woman who danced until dawn, who rode and hunted with ferocity, began to fade. Her appetite waned. Her laughter, once sharp and quick, became rare. Nights grew longer, and she took to pacing her chambers until sunrise, whispering prayers to no one. Servants spoke of strange shadows on the walls, of a voice that murmured the same phrase over and over. I will not yield to time. When portraits from her later years are compared, one notices the growing abstraction. The features are smoothed beyond recognition. Her face becomes a symbol, her body a vessel of symbols. Pearls for purity, serpents for wisdom, rainbows for divine favor. The woman herself vanishes beneath allegory. It is as if England's greatest queen was being erased, one brushstroke at a time, until only the myth remained. Even after her death, the illusion persisted. When her coffin was opened for embalming, witnesses noted that her skin appeared of an ashen hue. Yet painters continued to depict her as radiant, eternal. The state had no use for decay. The image was the monarchy was the image. The poison had done its work perfectly. Scholars who later examined the remnants of her cosmetics found high concentrations of lead, mercury, and sulfur. Modern science would call it systemic poisoning. But in her time, no one spoke that word. They called it devotion. To suffer for beauty was to prove one's nobility. To endure in silence was to earn reverence. The queen, who ruled for 45 years, became the embodiment of that creed. Her life, like her face, was an exquisite performance of endurance. Even now, centuries later, one can trace her influence in the fragments of fashion that survived her. The powdered faces of later courts, the wigs of the Stuarts, the painted visages of the Restoration, all are descendants of her mask. The Tudor idea that beauty is not natural but constructed, not given but earned through ritual and pain, became a foundation of Western aesthetics. It endures in every mirror that demands perfection, in every product that promises transformation. Yet beneath that legacy lies a haunting question. Did she know, truly, what it cost her? The chroniclers never agree. Some suggest she believed her appearance was a divine gift, a sign of God's favor. Others claim she saw through the illusion, understood its cruelty, but chose to embrace it anyway, preferring the certainty of control to the vulnerability of truth. In either case, the result was the same. The woman disappeared. The symbol endured. As the candle of her reign burned to its end, her courtiers noted how her speeches grew quieter, her eyes distant. When asked about her successor, she reportedly whispered, "I shall have no heir. I am married to my kingdom." Yet perhaps unknowingly, she left behind a different inheritance, a mirror that reflects not faces but obsessions, not truth but the longing for it. The beauty that had begun as artifice became a creed that outlived her body. In the echo of her name, one still hears the faint rustle of silk, the soft tap of brushes on porcelain skin, the whisper of servants laying out jars of powder and vials of crimson. And somewhere in that silence, the same question persists, unanswered. How much of what we call beauty is merely the slow perfection of our own undoing? The story of Tudor beauty is not finished, for its poisons linger in memory, in metaphor, in every age that confuses appearance with virtue. It began with Venetian ceruse, but it never truly ended. It became the art of surviving by illusion, a mirror that turns life into performance and performance into myth. And within that mirror, Elizabeth still stares back, unblinking, flawless, eternal. Her perfection purchased with her own decay. By the middle years of Elizabeth's reign, the white mask had become law. It was no longer a private choice, but a social commandment, an unspoken decree that defined who belonged and who did not. In portraits, masks, and processions, the court gleamed like a living pageant of ivory figures, faces pale as moonlight beneath towering wigs and glittering jewels. Yet this whiteness was not innocence. It was artifice sanctified. The more dangerous the ingredients, the higher the status they conferred. To bleed for beauty was to affirm one's place among the elect. From the chemist's tables came a new hierarchy of poisons. The most coveted rouge of the 1570s was vermilion, made from ground cinnabar, a substance rich in mercury sulfide. Imported through Italy from the mines of Almaden in Spain, it was prized for its crimson glow, the color of life itself. But the paradox was terrible. The pigment that gave the illusion of vitality was born of death. Miners who dug cinnabar rarely lived past 30, their lungs filled with silver dust, their skin burned by vapor. Yet the court paid fortunes for the powder, sealing their lips with the breath of the dying. The ritual of color was precise. After the white lead base came the blush, applied to the cheeks in small circles known as the roses. Then the lips, painted with vermilion paste mixed with almond oil or rendered animal fat to bind it to the skin. The scent was sweet, but beneath it lurked the metallic tang of mercury. Each smile, each word, released invisible poison into the air. It entered through the mouth, settled in the blood, and traveled to the heart. The same rouge that made a woman desirable slowly stilled the pulse beneath her skin. To the courtiers, this knowledge did not deter. It thrilled. There was a strange ecstasy in such danger, a sense that beauty itself had become a form of martyrdom. Poems praised the kiss of vermilion, the crimson of courage. Lovers compared their mistress's lips to sacramental wine. The act of painting them was almost liturgical, a confession, a transformation, a brief victory over decay. Elizabeth's own lips, famously thin and severe in her youth, became in later years a spectacle of defiance. They were painted bright enough to be seen across the great hall, a banner of color against her pallid face. Ambassadors described her mouth as glowing with strange light, like fire under snow. The Queen's perfumers kept several secret formulas for her use, each adjusted as her health declined. They added powdered coral to the mercury, rose oil to mask the metallic scent, and sometimes a drop of honey to keep the mixture pliable. The result was mesmerizing and lethal. The poisons did not stop at the lips. In pursuit of the Queen's iconic copper-red hair, the ladies of the court began to experiment with dyes of their own. Natural henna was rare and unreliable, so they turned to chemical alchemy. They steeped lead oxide, sulfur, and vinegar for days, then applied the mixture to their hair under heat. The reaction produced a vivid red hue, the same fiery shade that Elizabeth had worn since her youth, but it also burned the scalp, killed the follicles, and released choking fumes. The more faithful the imitation, the greater the suffering. Elizabeth herself, after years of treatment, lost much of her natural hair. To maintain her image, she commissioned elaborate wigs, each one crafted from threads of imported hair tinted to her chosen shade of flame. Over time, the wigs grew higher, heavier, and more intricate, symbols of the weight she bore as monarch. Some said she kept hundreds of them, arranged on stands like silent attendants. To enter her dressing room was to step into a gallery of her own faces, each one perfect, each one false. Yet these artifices were not merely aesthetic, they were tools of diplomacy. When foreign ambassadors visited, Elizabeth changed her appearance to manipulate perception. A Venetian observer recorded that she wore softer tones when negotiating peace, harsher colors when demanding tribute. Her image became a language no translator could misrepresent. Every layer of powder, every glint of red hair was a calculated message that England was radiant, untouchable, eternal. Still, the mask required maintenance, and maintenance required secrecy. The Queen's closest attendants were sworn to silence regarding her cosmetics. They performed their duties in near darkness, lit only by a few tallow candles and the red glow of the hearth. The process lasted hours. First, the face was stripped of the previous day's paint with a paste of egg whites and rose vinegar. Then came the ointments, creams of mercury and herbs to smooth the surface, camphor to soothe the burning, and almond oil to restore what little softness remained. Only after this could the new layers begin. One can imagine the intimacy of that chamber, the quiet rustle of silk, the faint hiss of boiling water, the Queen's breath steady but shallow as the brush traced across her skin. To those who watched, it must have seemed less like adornment and more like embalming. The line between preservation and decay had vanished. By the 1580s, the toll became visible. Observers spoke of her trembling hands, of her face cracking under the heat of summer, of the faint dust of powder that fell whenever she moved. Her eyes, once bright, grew watery and red-rimmed. Yet she endured it with stoic pride, as if each new wound were proof of her consecration. She had built herself into an icon, and icons do not bleed in public. The irony was cruel. The woman who had defied time was being consumed by the very elements that preserved her. Lead, mercury, sulfur. These were the same substances used by alchemists to transmute base metals into gold. The Queen's body had become a laboratory, her face an experiment in divine transformation. If she could not conquer death, she would at least refine it into art. And still, her courtiers followed. The ladies of the realm waged their own silent wars against imperfection. They bathed in buttermilk to soften their skin, rubbed their teeth with crushed coral to polish the stains left by mercury, and dabbed their wrists with vinegar steeped in lemon peel to imitate the scent of youth. For the hands, they applied a mixture of goose fat and white chalk. For the neck, a compress of bread soaked in spirits. That night, they slept with their faces covered in paste, the smell of decay mingling with the perfume of roses. In private correspondence, one lady confided that she could no longer smile without pain, her lips split and raw as though kissed by frost. Another wrote of headaches so fierce she believed them divine punishment. Still, they persisted. To appear without paint was to be invisible, to lose favor, invitations, prospects. The pursuit of beauty was the currency of power, and no one could afford to be poor. There were physicians who warned of the dangers. A few dared to suggest alternatives: plant dyes, natural clays, the juice of berries. They were dismissed as quacks or Puritan fanatics. The court demanded miracles, not moderation. And so the alchemists continued their work, each new concoction deadlier than the last. Among the more extreme was a beauty water made by distilling mercury with nitric acid. The vapors caused madness, the liquid blindness. Yet it sold well, for what was a little madness compared to perfection? By the end of the century, England's women had become walking monuments to the empire's contradictions, outwardly luminous, inwardly dying. The mirror, once an emblem of vanity, became a weapon of judgment. Every imperfection was a potential scandal. Some tore out the silvered glass from their rooms entirely, trusting instead in portraitists who could paint what reality had stolen. Others turned to charms, praying over their cosmetics as though prayer could purify poison. Meanwhile, in the Queen's private chapel, sermons praised chastity and humility, even as her courtiers powdered themselves into angels. Religion and artifice coexisted without conflict. The face was the soul's architecture. To perfect it was to perfect one's virtue. This belief, however warped, gave the practice a moral sheen. The pale face was not merely fashionable, it was righteous. Yet time, patient and impartial, began to unravel the illusion. In the winter of 1600, witnesses described the Queen as waxen, her features drawn, her eyes deep as wells. She refused to rest, refused to eat, refused even to sit during audiences, fearing that stillness would betray her frailty. The lead had seeped into her bones. Her mind, once razor-sharp, wandered into reverie. When her maids begged her to remove the paint, she struck one across the face. "Would you see me undone?" she whispered. "Then see England undone with me." It was not madness, but understanding. She knew that her body had become the kingdom's metaphor. As long as she appeared invincible, so too did England. When she faltered, the illusion of order would crumble. And so she stood, literally and symbolically, painted, perfumed, and dying. One final banquet remains recorded in a noble's diary. The Queen seated beneath a canopy of gold, her gown stiff with jewels, her face glowing under candlelight. When she smiled, powder fell from her cheeks like snow. The courtiers cheered. None dared to notice the tremor in her hands, the faint wheeze of her breath. She lifted a cup of spiced wine, drank, and whispered a Latin phrase, "Non sine sole iris." No rainbow without the sun. The guests thought it poetic. Perhaps it was farewell. When the feast ended, she retired to her chamber, refusing the attendants who tried to undress her. Alone, she sat before her mirror, the same mirror that had reflected her triumphs and disguises for half a century. What she saw that night, no one knows. The following morning, she was found slumped in her chair, her wig dislodged, her face streaked with the pale remains of her last ceruse. The illusion had finally cracked. Her death did not end the cult she had created. If anything, it deepened it. Painters, eager to preserve her myth, softened her features, brightened her lips, polished her skin. The mask lived on even as the woman beneath it turned to dust. The court that survived her adopted her rituals with renewed fervor, as though repetition might summon her spirit. The poisons that had killed her became heirlooms, passed from mother to daughter, from queen to courtier, a secret inheritance of pain, disguised as grace. And thus the Tudor age, born in splendor and stained with blood, closed with a whisper of powder and the faint scent of mercury. Its legacy was not only empire or faith or reform, but a vision of beauty so absolute it demanded sacrifice. To be flawless was to die slowly, smiling. To be human was to be forgotten. The archives end there, but the mirror remains. It waits, patient as ever, for the next face willing to trade its truth for light. In the years following Elizabeth's death, the silence of her chamber spread across the kingdom like a fog. The mirror was covered, the jars sealed, the attendants dismissed. Yet the air of that room, thick with the scent of vinegar, rosewater, and death, seemed to cling to England itself. Those who had served the Queen could not forget what they had seen: the rituals of paint and poison, the transformation of flesh into symbol. And though her body was gone, her illusion endured. The courtiers who had once trembled before her gaze now sought to preserve her legacy in themselves. They had learned that beauty was not mere ornament, but a form of dominion, a language more powerful than decrees. And so, the cult of perfection continued, no longer confined to one monarch, but spreading through the noble bloodlines of the realm. Daughters of dukes and earls adopted the pale mask as inheritance. To appear too natural was vulgar. To reveal one's own skin was scandalous. The age of artifice had become a dynasty. In those first years of the new century, a curious paradox emerged. The Elizabethan court, once radiant with ceremony, had given way to the colder manners of James I, a king whose interests lay not in beauty but theology. Yet even as the mask faded, its ghosts remained. Women still prepared their Venetian whites and carmine reds. They still burned their flesh for elegance. But without the queen's divine aura to sanctify their suffering, the practice lost its nobility and became obsession. Behind closed doors, London's apothecaries did brisk business, selling powders to desperate ladies who feared the natural toll of time. Recipes circulated in whispered exchange, mixtures of white lead and borax, of mercury and chalk. Some claim to have found safer alternatives: arsenic diluted in water, alum dissolved in vinegar. They spoke of herbs and ointments blessed by astrologers, of charms whispered under moonlight. Yet each formula, no matter how disguised, carried the same corruption. The body that sought purity was slowly defiled. The painters of the Jacobean era inherited their predecessors' deceit. They depicted ladies of the new court as glowing apparitions, faces smooth as porcelain, eyes shadowed in mystery. But beneath the pigments, reality turned cruel. Chroniclers began to record a strange affliction among noble women: trembling hands, fainting fits, blackened gums, and sudden madness. Physicians called it the pallid malady. Few connected it to the very cosmetics their patients adored. One physician, a scholar of curious courage, wrote that he had found in the viscera of a lady of high rank certain stones of metal like lead, which had, by long corruption, made her blood as heavy as the very substance itself. His manuscript was suppressed, his findings ridiculed. The court preferred ignorance to reform. It was easier to believe that sickness came from melancholy or witchcraft than from vanity. Meanwhile, among the people, beauty acquired a darker aura. The common folk, who once admired the painted splendor of the court, began to whisper that the pale faces of noble women were cursed. Ballads spread through taverns and marketplaces, telling of ladies who turned to stone, of queens who slept in coffins of glass, of maidens whose mirrors drank their souls. Superstition replaced admiration. To be too beautiful was to invite suspicion of sorcery. And so the pendulum swung. The same whiteness that had once signified virtue became a mark of deceit. Plays mocked it, preachers condemned it. In the pulpit, Puritan ministers thundered that the paint of Babylon still stains our daughters. They called cosmetics the devil's varnish, a gateway to sin. Women were urged to wash away their artifice and return to the honest dust from which they came. But the habit could not be so easily broken. Beneath the linen veils of piety, the old rituals persisted. Among these forbidden rites, one stands out in the fragments of testimony that survive: the cleansing by pigeon droppings. Ladies mixed the excrement with vinegar and alum, creating a paste believed to soften and renew the skin. The odor was unbearable, but they endured it as a kind of penance. To them, beauty was not pleasure, it was discipline. Pain meant progress. The more the face stung, the nearer they came to salvation. Others favored the milk bath, a practice borrowed from tales of Roman empresses. Milk was said to nourish the flesh, to undo the harm of lead. But it was illusion upon illusion. The softness it created lasted only hours, and beneath the surface, the poison continued its work. By the 1620s, English chemists began to write manuals of toilette secrets, adapting the old recipes for broader audiences. What had once been the guarded knowledge of queens now became accessible to merchants' wives and courtesans. In cheap pamphlets, one could find instructions for whitening the skin, reddening the lips, and blackening the brows. The language of alchemy was replaced by the language of commerce. The same ingredients that had killed monarchs now filled the shelves of every city apothecary. The transformation was complete. Beauty had become an industry. There were, of course, dissenters, voices that spoke with fear or pity. A few humanists warned that the relentless pursuit of perfection would erode not just the body but the soul. One writer compared the painted face to a counterfeit coin, bright to the eye, worthless in essence. Another lamented that our women, in chasing angels, have become phantoms. But their words fell on deaf ears. The hunger for illusion was stronger than morality. Meanwhile, the arts continued to feed the myth. Portraiture grew ever more stylized. The faces of noble women were rendered smooth as glass, their eyes turned upward in perpetual serenity. The viewer could no longer distinguish age, emotion, or truth. It was not depiction, it was denial. In that denial, the spirit of Elizabeth still reigned. Her ghost haunted every canvas, whispering that power could only exist where the flesh refused to decay. Outside the palaces, in the damp streets of London, the obsession took grotesque forms. Traveling peddlers sold cheap imitations of the Queen's cosmetics, chalk mixed with ashes, vermilion laced with brick dust. Prostitutes powdered their faces until they glowed pale under candlelight, mimicking royalty. The contrast between the living and the dying blurred entirely. The city at night became a procession of masks, each one glowing faintly like a lantern before it burned out. Yet even as beauty became democratic, its dangers multiplied. Without skilled apothecaries to refine their mixtures, common women suffered faster, harsher deaths. There are parish records of sudden collapses, of strange fevers, of jaw rot, and face wasting. Some were buried without names, their once lovely features too disfigured to identify. The age that had worshipped perfection had birthed a new class of victims, the nameless dead of vanity's empire. It is here, in these anonymous graves, that the story of Tudor beauty reaches its true horror. For while queens and nobles left portraits and poems, these women left only silence. Their deaths were not chronicled, their suffering not memorialized. And yet they too were children of Elizabeth's mirror, drawn to the same fatal promise, that beauty could make one immortal. In their bones, archaeologists centuries later would find traces of lead and mercury, the fingerprints of a dream that never died. By the mid-17th century, Europe had begun to change. Science advanced, though superstition clung like ivy to its edges. Physicians dissected bodies, studied humors, and named diseases. They began to suspect what poets had long sensed, that the instruments of beauty were killing their bearers. The French called lead the white demon, The Italians renamed ceruse the Queen's curse. But habit is stronger than reason. Even as warnings spread, the powders sold better than ever. The English court, now under Charles I, revived the old splendor in defiance of austerity. His queen, Henrietta Maria, adored the pale style of her predecessor and made it fashionable once more. She imported Venetian powders by the crate, painted her face for every mask, and demanded her ladies follow suit. History repeated itself like a ritual exorcism. The ghosts of the Tudors found new hosts. But no ritual can last forever. Civil war tore England apart. The monarchy fell. The painted faces vanished into exile, replaced by the grim countenances of Puritan rule. For a time, simplicity reigned. Women washed away their powders. Men mocked vanity as sin. Yet the memory of radiance lingered, waiting to be reborn. When the Restoration came, it returned in full splendor, rouge redder, wigs taller, perfumes thicker. The poisons were still there, disguised under new names, refined but unchanged. Through each generation, the same whisper passed from mother to daughter. To be admired is to exist. To exist without admiration is to fade. The cult of beauty, born in the Tudor court, had outlived its creators. It no longer needed queens or alchemists. It lived in mirrors, in memory, in every gaze that equated pallor with power. And though science would one day expose the chemistry of its poisons, the deeper poison, the need to perfect what nature made, would never be cured. In the manuscripts left behind by Elizabeth's apothecaries, there are stains that no cleaning has erased. Dark fingerprints, smudges of unknown origin. Some scholars believe they are remnants of lead oxide, others that they are ink from later hands. Yet one cannot look at them without imagining the trembling fingers that once mixed those deadly pastes, the hush of servants as the monarch's mask was applied. It was there, in those moments of transformation, that England learned the most enduring of its lessons, that beauty, once enthroned, demands sacrifice eternal. And so the story moves onward, as if the mirror itself had memory. Each new century merely polishes its surface, replacing lead with powder, mercury with glass, and faith with longing. But the reflection is the same. A pale face, composed, luminous, and doomed, staring back at us through time, asking whether we too will pay the price she did. When the century turned again, and the ashes of the old monarchies cooled, the image of the Virgin Queen did not fade, it merely changed its costume. In paintings, pamphlets, and plays, Elizabeth's whitened face lingered as a symbol of order, reason, and divine rule. But beneath that halo lay the memory of lead, the slow rot of flesh beneath paint. The contradiction was irresistible. Artists adored her purity. Scholars whispered of her decay. She had become both saint and spectre, the Immaculate Mother of England and the ghost who refused to die. By the 18th century, that ghost had taken root not only in the court but in culture itself. The obsession she had birthed was no longer confined to palaces or titled women. It had filtered down through every layer of English society, shaping ideals that no one remembered how to question. A young merchant's wife in Bristol might powder her face before a dinner party. A theatre actress in London might rouge her lips before stepping into the light. The tools had changed, the rituals softened, but the idea remained the same. Beauty was duty, and pain its silent price. In a sense, the country had become the Queen's mirror. Her alchemy of image and power had been perfected into a new social order. The nobility ruled through appearances. Merchants bought refinement in jars and perfumes. Even religion, once a bulwark against vanity, found itself preaching cleanliness and composure as virtues. What Elizabeth had begun as artifice now masqueraded as morality. Yet, beneath the refinement, the same poisons lingered. London's apothecaries stocked powders of pearl white and angelic bloom, little different from Venetian ceruse. They came in ivory boxes, lined with silk, engraved with Latin mottos promising purity. Few asked what lay inside. Lead carbonate, mercury chloride, and sulfur still ruled the vanity tables of Europe. And while science had grown bold enough to name their dangers, it had not grown brave enough to challenge desire. In the quiet parlors of polite society, mothers taught their daughters how to mix powder discreetly, how to paint just enough rouge to suggest health, but not lust. These gestures, innocent in appearance, were fragments of an older creed. Each brushstroke echoed the unspoken memory of the Queen who had taught a nation that beauty was power and that to age was treason. The artists of the Enlightenment carried her torch in subtler ways. Portraitists softened the old masks, but never abandoned them. Their sitters glowed with the same diffused whiteness, their features blurred into the same ideal symmetry. Flesh, again, was replaced by symbol. The mirror remained polished, the poison now hid behind philosophy. Where the Tudors spoke of divine grace, the New Age spoke of reason, but both meant control. The body had to be governed, improved, corrected. In the archives of St. Paul's Parish, one can find a coroner's report from 1752, describing the death of a gentlewoman of 27 years, lately much admired for her complexion. The cause, ingestion of sweet spirits of mercury, a fashionable tonic sold as a purifier of the skin. The physician's note reads almost apologetically. She took it willingly, believing herself to be bettered. That phrase, believing herself to be bettered, captures the true inheritance of the Tudor mirror. It was no longer the poison that killed. It was the belief that perfection was worth dying for. As the centuries unfolded, the formulas changed again. Chemists replaced lead with zinc, mercury with arsenic, then with bismuth, then with chemicals whose names sounded safe. Each generation declared itself wiser, cleaner, more humane. Yet in every new product lay the echo of the old creed: purity at any cost. When the Victorians powdered their faces and bleached their hands, they thought themselves moral, untouched by vanity. But they too were descendants of Elizabeth's illusion, the belief that appearance could sanctify the soul. And so the myth endured, carried forward by progress itself. The industrial age multiplied what alchemy had whispered. Factories produced powders by the ton. Advertisements promised transformation in a week. The Queen's dressing table became an empire. Across continents, women who had never heard her name painted their faces in her likeness. The mirror had conquered the world. But the story's cruelty did not end in cosmetics. It bled into the very fabric of how society saw women. The expectation that beauty was duty, that composure was worth suffering, hardened into law. Women were judged not by what they did, but by how they appeared while doing it. The Tudor doctrine of grace through artifice became the modern tyranny of appearance. From the lead pot to the silver screen, the same rule endured: the mask must never crack. And still, the shadow of the Queen persisted. Her portraits hung in museums, her likeness stamped on coins, her face scrubbed of every flaw. Schoolchildren learned of her victories, of the Armada, of her speeches, of her golden age, but not of the slow, invisible war she waged against her own reflection. The myth of Elizabeth, radiant and unaging, had triumphed completely. History had chosen the mask over the woman. Yet beneath the polish of textbooks and portraits, fragments of truth remained. In the sealed letters of her physicians, there are references to tremors, tooth decay, foul humors of the skin. In inventories of her belongings, entries list a box of Venetian ceruse, 2 ounces remaining, and a wig of red hair with pearl pins, much worn. They read like confessions written in code, evidence of the body that history tried to erase. Modern historians, armed with science, would later confirm what the Whispers always knew. The Queen's blood carried enough lead to kill a lesser person several times over. The paint that preserved her beauty had poisoned her from within, slowly eroding her nerves, her vision, her strength. Yet she ruled until her last breath, refusing to show weakness. Perhaps she understood what few monarchs ever did, that the illusion of immortality is often more powerful than life itself. When her tomb was opened centuries later for restoration, witnesses remarked on the pallor of her preserved skin, still faintly gray, almost metallic. They did not say it aloud, but the irony hung heavy in the air. The woman who sought eternal whiteness had achieved it. The poison had outlasted the flesh. It is tempting to think of the Tudors as creatures of another world, superstitious, extravagant, blind to their own peril. Yet to read their story closely is to see our own reflection. We too build empires of illusion. We too chase perfection in glass and screen. The powders have changed names. The poisons are subtler. But the faith remains identical. That beauty is salvation, that to be seen is to be worthy. The same ghost that whispered to Elizabeth now speaks through the glow of advertisements, the shimmer of filters, the quiet panic of aging. Perhaps that is why her legend endures. She was the first to perfect what we have only refined, the art of living behind an image. Her face, half divine and half dead, became a mirror not only of her time but of ours. To look upon it is to confront the oldest temptation, to believe that control over appearance is control over destiny. The chroniclers who stood by her deathbed wrote that she died sitting upright, refusing to lie down even as her strength failed. She would not surrender to gravity, to flesh, to time. When her servants begged her to rest, she whispered, "Little man's rest is not for me." Perhaps she meant sleep. Perhaps she meant mortality. Either way, she left the world as she had lived in it, composed, painted, defiant. In that final image, her lips stiff with vermilion, her skin pale as bone, her hair a crown of fading flame, lies the last truth of the Tudor mirror. Beauty, in its purest form, was never about pleasure or desire. It was about control, the power to command how one would be remembered, even if it meant ceasing to live in order to remain adored. And so the centuries close, and the scroll of her legend rolls shut. The powders of lead have turned to dust. The wigs have rotted into threads. Yet somewhere, under museum glass, her portraits still gleam, the same cold, impossible white. Tourists stare and marvel, unaware that the glow they admire is the residue of death. They see the mask, not the wound. That, perhaps, is the final enchantment. The poisons of the Tudors were not confined to jars and powders. They entered language, memory, and myth. They taught us that to be beautiful is to be powerful, and to be powerful is to be untouchable. And so long as that belief endures, the mirror remains unbroken. If one listens closely in the galleries where her painted eyes still watch, there is a faint hum, like breath trapped in glass. It might be imagination, or it might be the echo of her court, the rustle of silk, the murmur of attendants preparing the fatal mixture. It might be the whisper that passed through every generation since. Better pale and dead than dark and plain. And perhaps, as the candle gutters in the empty hall of memory, one realizes that Elizabeth never truly died. She lives in every face that hides behind perfection, in every mirror that demands worship, in every promise that beauty can banish decay. Her empire did not end with her dynasty. It moved into ours. For the poisons she wore were only the beginning. The true venom was the idea itself, bright, eternal, and undying. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.